In the heart of the antebellum South, where cotton fields stretch endlessly under the scorching sun, some secrets grow deeper than the roots of ancient oak trees. This is a story of power, guilt, and the children who bear the weight of their father's sins. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping historical dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The morning mist clung to Magnolia Grove Plantation like a shroud, obscuring the sprawling cotton fields that had made Master Edmund Whitmore one of the wealthiest men in Georgia. It was September 1847, and the air carried the weight of an unusually humid autumn, thick with the scent of ripening cotton and something else, something that felt like impending change. Edmund stood by the tall windows of the grand parlor, his silhouette dark against the streaming sunlight. At 42, he was a man accustomed to control, to having his word be law across the 1,000 acres he owned. His hands were clasped behind his back as he gazed out at his domain, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the suffocating reality of what his household had become. Behind him, in the ornate room with its high ceilings and expensive wallpaper, sat his wife Margaret on the velvet sofa. Her dark hair was perfectly arranged despite the early hour, and she wore a deep blue gown with intricate lace trim. In her arms, she held their 3-month-old daughter Elizabeth, wrapped in the finest white cotton and lace that money could buy. Margaret's face bore the practiced composure of a southern lady, but her eyes held a weariness that no amount of powder could conceal. Standing slightly behind the sofa was Lily, a young enslaved woman of 19 with gentle features and intelligent eyes that had seen too much. She too held a baby, a boy, also 3 months old, wrapped in simple but clean white cloth. The child's skin was lighter than his mother's, and anyone with eyes could see the resemblance to the man standing at the window. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft cooing of the infants and the distant sound of field hands beginning their day's work. 3 adults, 2 babies, and a secret that threatened to tear apart everything Edmund had built. "The children are restless this morning," Margaret finally spoke, her voice carefully modulated. She didn't look at Lily, hadn't looked directly at her since the births. "Perhaps they sense the change in weather." Edmund turned from the window, his grey eyes moving between his wife and the enslaved woman who had borne his son. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like the humid Georgia air. He had wanted a son, an heir to carry on the Whitmore name and inherit the plantation. Instead, his legitimate child was a daughter, while his bastard son would grow up in the quarters, forever marked by the circumstances of his birth. "Master Edmund," Lily spoke softly, her voice barely audible, "young Thomas needs—" "Don't!" Edmund's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Don't speak his name in this house." Lily's eyes flashed with a pain so deep it seemed to echo through the ornate room. She adjusted the baby in her arms, and the child, Thomas, gurgled softly, unaware of the tension surrounding him. Margaret's grip tightened on her own child. "Edmund, we need to discuss the arrangements. People are beginning to talk. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned at church last Sunday that she noticed similarities." The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Similarities, as if the truth could be hidden by careful words and averted gazes. Edmund moved to the mahogany table in the center of the room, where 3 candles flickered in an ornate candelabra. The dancing flames cast shifting shadows on the walls, making the room feel alive with secrets. He picked up a crystal glass from the silver tray, though it was barely past dawn. Too early for whiskey, but not too early for the kind of desperation that drove a man to drink. "The boy will be raised in the quarters," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Lily will continue her duties in the house until Elizabeth is weaned, then she'll return to fieldwork." "And if people ask questions?" Margaret's voice was steady, but Edmund could hear the steel beneath the silk. "Let them ask. A man's business is his own." But even as he spoke the words, Edmund knew they were hollow. in the tight-knit society of the antebellum South. Reputation was everything. A whisper could destroy a man faster than a failed crop, and the evidence of his indiscretion was growing stronger every day as young Thomas developed features that mirrored his own. Lily shifted the baby to her other arm, and for a moment her eyes met Edmund's across the room. In that brief exchange, he saw not just the pain of a mother fearing for her child's future, but something else, a quiet strength that unnerved him. She had never asked for anything, never demanded recognition or support for their son. Her silence was both a blessing and a curse, for it allowed him to pretend, but it also meant he could never truly escape what he had done. "I should take Thomas to the kitchen," Lily said quietly. "Cook will be needing help with breakfast preparations." Margaret nodded without looking up. "Yes, go. And Lily?" The enslaved woman paused at the doorway. "Remember your place." The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of a threat. Lily's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly before she bowed her head and left the room, taking with her the living reminder of Edmund's shame. As the door closed behind her, Edmund and Margaret were left alone with their legitimate daughter and the suffocating weight of their shared secret. The morning light continued to stream through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, witnesses to the drama unfolding in the grand parlor of Magnolia Grove. "She's getting ideas above her station," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can see it in her eyes." Edmund set down his glass without drinking from it. "Lily knows her place." "Does she? Because I see the way she looks at that boy, Edmund. Like he's something precious. Like he matters." The words hit Edmund like a physical blow. Because Thomas did matter, in ways that Edmund couldn't admit even to himself. The boy was his son, his blood, his heir in everything but name, and that knowledge was eating him alive. Outside, the plantation was coming to life. The sound of voices drifted up from the quarters as families began their day, and the overseer's bell rang out across the fields, calling the workers to their labor. It was the same routine that had played out for years, but everything felt different now. Everything had changed the moment 2 babies had entered the world 3 months ago, carrying with them the power to destroy or transform everything Edmund had built. As Margaret rose from the sofa with Elizabeth in her arms, preparing to retreat to the nursery, Edmund remained by the window. He watched as Lily emerged from the house below, Thomas still in her arms, and made her way toward the kitchen building. Even from this distance, he could see the careful way she held the child, the protective curve of her body around his small form. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the plantation in all its contradictory glory, beautiful and terrible, prosperous and built on suffering. A place where love and cruelty existed side by side, like the cotton and the thorns that protected it. Edmund Whitmore had everything a man could want: wealth, status, a beautiful wife, and now a daughter to dote upon. But he also had a son he couldn't claim and a conscience that wouldn't let him forget. As he stood in his grand parlor, surrounded by all the trappings of his success, he felt more trapped than the poorest field hand in his quarters. The day stretched ahead, full of the usual routines and responsibilities, but Edmund knew that nothing would ever be the same. The seeds of his shame had been planted, and now he would have to live with whatever grew from them. 5 years had passed since that humid September morning, and the Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Magnolia Grove, as it always did in the height of summer. The year was 1852, and the plantation thrived under Edmund's careful management, but the master himself had aged beyond his years. Lines of worry etched his face, and his once commanding presence had taken on a haunted quality that didn't go unnoticed by those who knew him well. In the grand parlour where secrets had once been whispered, 5-year-old Elizabeth Whitmore played with her porcelain dolls, her golden curls catching the afternoon light that streamed through the tall windows. She was the picture of Southern belle perfection, delicate, well-mannered, and utterly unaware of the complexity of her world. Her laughter rang through the house like silver bells, a sound that should have brought joy but instead served as a constant reminder of what Edmund had gained and lost. "Mama, why can't I play with Thomas?" Elizabeth asked one sweltering afternoon, looking up from her dolls with innocent blue eyes. "He's my age, and he knows such interesting games." Margaret, now 35 and still beautiful despite the strain that had settled around her eyes, set down her embroidery with hands that trembled slightly. "Elizabeth, darling, we've discussed this. Thomas is different. He has his own friends in the quarters. But he's so clever, Mama. Yesterday, when Lily brought him to help in the kitchen, he showed me how to make animals from corn husks, and he can already read some words. I heard him reading to himself from the Bible in the kitchen." The needle slipped in Margaret's hand, pricking her finger. A drop of blood stained the white fabric, spreading like a small crimson flower. "Reading?" Her voice was carefully controlled. "Who taught him to read?" Elizabeth shrugged with the casual indifference of childhood. "I don't know. Maybe he learned from watching me with Miss Patterson during my lessons." Margaret's heart raced. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Georgia, and if word got out that there was a literate child in the quarters, especially one who bore such a striking resemblance to the master, it could bring unwanted attention from authorities and neighbors alike. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the formal dining room, Margaret broached the subject with Edmund. The room was lit by crystal chandeliers, and the table was set with their finest china, but the atmosphere was tense. "Edmund, we have a problem," Margaret began, cutting her roast beef with precise movements. "Elizabeth tells me that the boy, Thomas, can read." Edmund's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Across the table, Elizabeth continued eating, humming softly to herself. Oblivious to the storm her innocent words had unleashed. "That's impossible," Edmund said finally. "None of the house servants can read. I've made sure of that." Apparently, he's been observing Elizabeth's lessons. She says he was reading from the Bible in the kitchen. Edmund set down his fork, his appetite gone. The implications were staggering. A reading slave was dangerous enough, but a reading slave who was his own son. The boy was already drawing attention with his light skin and his resemblance to Edmund. Adding literacy to the mix was like adding kindling to a fire. "I'll speak with Lily," he said quietly. "You'll do more than speak." Margaret's voice carried an edge that Edmund rarely heard. "This cannot continue. The boy is becoming too visible. Mrs. Pemberton asked me directly last week if I'd noticed how much he resembles you. I managed to deflect, but barely." Elizabeth looked up from her plate, sensing the tension. "Are you talking about Thomas again? I like Thomas. He's nice to me." "Finish your dinner, sweetheart," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "Adults are talking." Later that night, after Elizabeth had been tucked into bed by her governess, Edmund made his way to the quarters. The moon was full, casting silver light across the small cabins where his enslaved workers lived. The air was thick with the sounds of evening, crickets chirping, a baby crying somewhere in the distance, the low murmur of voices from families settling in for the night. He found Lily sitting on the small porch of her cabin, mending a shirt by lamplight. Thomas sat beside her, his head bent over a piece of slate, carefully forming letters with a small piece of chalk. The sight stopped Edmund cold. The boy's concentration was absolute, his tongue poking out slightly as he worked, and the resemblance to Edmund's own childhood habits was unmistakable. "Lily." Edmund's voice cut through the night air. Both mother and son looked up, startled. Lily quickly moved to hide the slate, but it was too late. Edmund had seen everything. "Master Edmund!" Lily stood quickly, her body instinctively moving to shield Thomas. "We weren't expecting... inside now." Edmund's voice brooked no argument. The small cabin was sparse but clean, with a bed, a simple table, and a few personal belongings. Thomas stood close to his mother, his dark eyes, so like Edmund's own, watching the master with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Where did you get the slate?" Edmund demanded. Lily's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of defiance that was both brave and foolish. "I found it, master, broken piece from the big house. I thought it would do no harm for the boy to learn his letters." "You thought wrong." Edmund's voice was cold, but inside he was fighting a war between anger and something else. Pride, perhaps, at his son's obvious intelligence. "It's against the law, Lily. You know that." "Yes, master, I know." Her voice was steady, but Edmund could see the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for her son. Thomas stepped forward, his small hand reaching for the slate. "Mama, I was just practicing my name, like Miss Elizabeth does." The innocence in the boy's voice hit Edmund like a physical blow. Here was his son, bright and eager to learn, and Edmund was about to crush that spark to protect his own reputation. "Thomas," Edmund said, his voice softer now. "Come here." The boy looked to his mother, who nodded reluctantly. Thomas approached Edmund with the fearless curiosity of childhood, and Edmund found himself looking into eyes that were mirror images of his own. "Show me what you've learned," Edmund said quietly. Thomas's face lit up with pride as he took the slate and carefully wrote his name, Thomas. The letters were shaky, but recognizable, the work of a child who had been practicing in secret. "Very good," Edmund found himself saying. "Who taught you?" "Mama helped, but mostly I watched Miss Elizabeth with her teacher. I hid behind the door sometimes." Thomas looked up at Edmund with complete honesty. "I want to learn to read like the masters do." The words pierced Edmund's heart. Here was his son, hungry for knowledge, for the very education that Edmund's legitimate children would receive without question. But Thomas would never be allowed in a classroom, never attend university, never inherit anything more than the clothes on his back. "Thomas," Lily said gently, "go outside and play for a moment. Master Edmund and I need to talk." The boy nodded and skipped outside, leaving the two adults alone in the small cabin. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. "He's bright," Edmund said finally. "Yes, master, he is." Lily's voice held a note of fierce maternal pride. "He learns faster than any child I've ever seen. He asks questions about everything: why the sky is blue, how plants grow, what makes the wind blow." Edmund closed his eyes, fighting against the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "You have to stop teaching him, Lily. If anyone finds out—" "I know what will happen," Lily interrupted, then caught herself. "Forgive me, master. I didn't mean to speak out of turn." "What will happen, Lily?" Edmund's voice was quiet, dangerous. Lily met his eyes directly, and in that moment, Edmund saw not just the enslaved woman who served in his house, but the mother who would do anything to protect her child. "They'll sell him away from me, or worse." The truth hung between them like a sword. Edmund had the power to destroy both their lives with a single word, and they all knew it. He can't read, Lily, not anymore, and he can't be seen around Elizabeth so much. People are starting to talk. Tears gathered in Lily's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Yes, master." Edmund turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Lily." "Yes, master." "Keep him safe." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of paternity that Edmund had ever given, and they both knew it. As he walked back to the big house under the star-filled sky, Edmund felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him like the humid Georgia air. Behind him in the small cabin, Lily held her son close and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Thomas was growing up, becoming more noticeable, more obviously Edmund's child with each passing day. And in the rigid hierarchy of the antebellum South, there was no place for a boy who existed between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The seeds of shame that Edmund had planted 5 years ago were growing into something larger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And as the summer heat pressed down on Magnolia Grove, everyone could feel that change was coming, change that would test every bond of blood, loyalty, and love that held their fractured family together. The autumn of 1857 brought with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of Magnolia Grove. 10 years had passed since the births that had forever altered the Whitmore household, and the plantation continued to prosper even as the nation teetered on the edge of conflict over the very institution that made Edmund's wealth possible. Thomas, now 10 years old, had grown into a striking child whose resemblance to Edmund could no longer be dismissed or ignored. His features had sharpened, revealing the strong jawline and intelligent eyes that marked him unmistakably as a Whitmore, despite his mother's heritage. He worked alongside Lily in the house, officially as her helper. But everyone knew he was being kept close for reasons that had nothing to do with his usefulness as a servant. Elizabeth, also 10, had blossomed into a precocious child with her father's intelligence and her mother's beauty. Despite her parents' efforts to keep the children apart, she had formed a bond with Thomas that transcended the social barriers meant to divide them. In her innocent way, she had begun to question the world around her with an intensity that made both Edmund and Margaret increasingly uncomfortable. The crisis came on a grey November morning when Elizabeth burst into the parlour, where Margaret was receiving Mrs. Pemberton and 2 other ladies from neighbouring plantations for their weekly social call. "Mamma!" Elizabeth exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Thomas taught me the most wonderful poem. He knows so many words, and he says—" "Elizabeth," Margaret's sharp voice cut through her daughter's enthusiasm like a blade. "What have I told you about interrupting when I have guests?" The little girl's face fell, but Mrs. Pemberton, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with a reputation for gossip, leaned forward with interest. "Thomas, that would be Lily's boy, wouldn't it? The one with the unusual colouring." Margaret's smile was strained. "Yes, he helps his mother with various tasks around the house." "How remarkable that he knows poetry," Mrs. Pemberton continued, her tone deceptively casual. "I wasn't aware that any of your people were educated in such things." Elizabeth, oblivious to the dangerous waters she was navigating, piped up again. "Oh, Thomas is very smart. He can read better than some of the children at church, and he knows all sorts of stories. Papa says, 'Elizabeth, go to your room immediately,'" Margaret commanded, her voice brooking no argument. As Elizabeth reluctantly left the parlour, Mrs. Pemberton exchanged meaningful glances with the other ladies. "How interesting, a reading slave child. I do hope you're careful about such things. Margaret dear, the authorities take a very dim view of educated Negroes, especially in these troubled times." After the ladies left, Margaret found Edmund in his study, poring over plantation ledgers with an intensity that suggested he was trying to lose himself in numbers rather than face the reality of their situation. "We have a problem," Margaret announced, without preamble. Edmund looked up, noting the tight lines around his wife's mouth. "Mrs. Pemberton. She knows. They all know, or at least suspect. Elizabeth practically announced to the entire county that Thomas can read and that you've been involved in his education." Edmund set down his pen with deliberate care. "What exactly did she say?" Enough. More than enough. Margaret began pacing the length of the study, her silk dress rustling with each agitated step. Edmund, we cannot continue like this. The boy is becoming too visible, too obviously yours. And now, with this reading business, I never taught him to read, Edmund said quietly. But you didn't stop it either, did you? You've been protecting him, keeping him close. And people are beginning to wonder why a plantation master would take such interest in one particular slave child. Edmund stood and moved to the window, looking out at the fields where his workers were bringing in the last of the cotton harvest. In the distance, he could see Thomas helping to load a wagon, his small frame working alongside the adults with a determination that reminded Edmund painfully of himself at that age. "What do you want me to do, Margaret? Sell my own son?" The words hung in the air between them, the first time Edmund had ever explicitly acknowledged Thomas's parentage to his wife. Margaret stopped pacing, her face going pale. "So you admit it," she whispered. "We both know what he is," Edmund replied, not turning from the window. "The question is what we do about it." Margaret sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "I've tried, Edmund. God knows I've tried to pretend, to maintain the fiction that he's just another servant's child. But every day he looks more like you, and every day Elizabeth becomes more attached to him. She asks questions I can't answer, makes observations I can't explain away." "What kind of questions?" "Why Thomas has to sleep in the quarters when he's so much smarter than the other children. Why he can't eat at our table when he knows better manners than most white children. Why people look at him strangely when we go to town." Margaret's voice broke slightly. "She's starting to piece it together, Edmund. Our daughter is beginning to understand that her playmate is her brother." The word hit Edmund like a physical blow. Brother. It was a relationship that could never be acknowledged, never celebrated, never legally recognized. In the eyes of the law and society, Thomas was property, not family. "Perhaps," Margaret continued, her voice steadying, "it's time to consider other options, such as the Hendersons in Savannah have been looking for a house servant. A bright boy like Thomas would be valuable to them. He could have a good life there, away from complications." Edmund turned from the window, his eyes blazing. "You want me to sell him to strangers?" "I want you to save him." Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. "Don't you see what's happening? Every day he stays here, he's in more danger, not just from gossip or legal troubles, but from the very fact of what he represents. He's a living reminder of your indiscretion. And as he grows older, as he becomes more obviously your son, that reminder will become unbearable." "To whom?" "To you, Edmund. To me, to Elizabeth when she fully understands the truth, and to Thomas himself when he realizes that he can never be anything more than what he is now." That evening, Edmund found himself walking to the quarters, as he had so many times over the years. The November air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the cabin chimneys and the distant sound of singing from one of the family gatherings. He found Thomas sitting alone on the steps of Lily's cabin, reading by the light of a small oil lamp. The boy looked up as Edmund approached, his face lighting up with a smile that was heartbreakingly familiar. "Master Edmund, look, I've been practicing my letters." Thomas held up a piece of paper covered with careful script. "Mama says I write almost as well as Miss Elizabeth now." Edmund sat down beside his son, something he had never done before. The gesture felt both natural and revolutionary. "What are you reading?" "The Bible, sir. The story of Moses leading his people out of Egypt. Mama says it's important to know Bible stories." "And what do you think of the story?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness that Edmund had come to associate with the boy's approach to everything. "I think Moses was very brave." But I wonder what it felt like to wander in the desert for so long, not knowing where you belonged." The words pierced Edmund's heart. Here was his son, unknowingly describing his own situation, caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. "Thomas," Edmund said carefully, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" The boy's eyes shone with dreams that Edmund knew could never be fulfilled. "I want to be like you, Master Edmund. I want to own land and have books and make important decisions. Mama says that's not possible for someone like me. But I think maybe if I learn enough, if I'm smart enough." Edmund closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his son's impossible dreams. "Thomas, there are things about the world that are complicated, things that aren't fair, but that we can't change. Like why I can't sit at the big table, even though I know how to use all the forks. Yes, like that." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Edmund with eyes that held too much understanding for a 10-year-old. "Master Edmund, are you my papa?" The question hung in the night air like a challenge to everything Edmund had built his life upon. He looked into his son's face, so like his own, so full of hope and intelligence and love, and felt something break inside his chest. "Why do you ask that?" "Because Miss Elizabeth says I look like you, and because you look at me sometimes the way Papa looks at her, and because—" Thomas hesitated, then forged ahead with the fearless honesty of childhood. "Because I feel like you might be, and I want you to be." Edmund reached out and touched his son's face, a gesture of tenderness that he had denied himself for 10 years. "Thomas, there are some truths that are too dangerous to speak aloud, but you can feel them in your heart? Yes, you can feel them in your heart." Thomas smiled, a radiant expression that lit up his entire face. "Then I'll keep the truth in my heart, Papa, where it's safe." As Edmund walked back to the big house that night, he carried with him the weight of his son's love, and the terrible knowledge that love alone might not be enough to protect the boy from the world they lived in. The autumn wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of winter and the certainty that change was coming to Magnolia Grove. Change that would test every bond of blood and love that held their fractured family together. Behind him, in the small cabin, Lily held her son close and listened as he whispered about the conversation with his father. She knew, as only a mother could, that their time of relative safety was coming to an end. The boy was growing up, becoming more dangerous to Edmund's reputation with each passing day, and in the harsh reality of the antebellum South, love was often not enough to overcome the brutal mathematics of survival. The spring of 1858 arrived with an unusual violence, bringing torrential rains that turned the red Georgia clay into rivers of mud and seemed to wash away the last vestiges of the old order. The nation was fracturing along the lines of slavery and freedom, and even in the insulated world of Magnolia Grove, the tremors of coming change could be felt. Edmund stood in his study on a rain-soaked April morning, reading a letter that had arrived with the dawn. The paper trembled in his hands as he absorbed its contents. A formal inquiry from the county sheriff about reports of an educated Negro child on his plantation. Someone had finally made an official complaint, and Edmund knew without doubt who that someone was. "Margaret!" he called, his voice carrying a note of urgency that brought his wife running. She appeared in the doorway, her face already pale with apprehension. Over the past months, the strain of their situation had aged her visibly, adding lines around her eyes and a brittleness to her movements. "What is it?" Edmund handed her the letter without a word. As she read, he watched the color drain completely from her face. "Mrs. Pemberton," she whispered. "She's finally done it." "The sheriff will be here tomorrow," Edmund said, his voice hollow. "He'll want to see Thomas to verify the reports of his education." Margaret sank into a chair, the letter falling from her nerveless fingers. "What will we do?" Before Edmund could answer, the sound of children's laughter drifted up from the garden below. Through the rain-streaked window, they could see Elizabeth and Thomas playing together under the covered porch, sharing a book and pointing excitedly at the pictures. The sight, which should have brought joy, now filled Edmund with dread. "We have to send him away," Margaret said quietly. "Tonight, before the sheriff arrives." "Where?" Edmund's voice was raw with pain. "Where can he go that will be safe?" "The Hendersons in Savannah are still interested. I received a letter from Mrs. Henderson just last week. They would treat him well, Edmund. He would have a good life there." "He would be a slave there," Edmund corrected harshly. "Property, owned by strangers who would never see him as anything more than a useful servant." "And what is he here?" Margaret's voice rose with desperation. "What can he ever be here except a constant reminder of what you've done? At least in Savannah, he would be safe from the law, safe from the questions and the suspicions." Edmund turned back to the window, watching his children, for that's what they were, both of them his children, sharing their innocent joy. "I can't do it, Margaret. I can't sell my own son." "Then you'll watch him hang," Margaret said with brutal honesty. "Because that's what will happen if the authorities discover that you've been allowing an enslaved child to be educated. They'll make an example of him, Edmund, and of Lily, and possibly of you as well." The truth of her words hit Edmund like a physical blow. In the increasingly paranoid atmosphere of the pre-war South, the education of enslaved people was seen as a direct threat to the social order. The penalties were severe, and they were enforced without mercy. That afternoon, as the rain continued to fall, Edmund made his way to the quarters to find Lily. He discovered her in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal with Thomas at her side, helping with the simple tasks that had become their routine. The domestic scene, mother and son working together in comfortable companionship, made what he had to do even more difficult. "Lily, I need to speak with you. Alone." Thomas looked up from the vegetables he was chopping, his face bright with the smile that always greeted Edmund's arrival. "Master Edmund, Mama's teaching me to make cornbread. Would you like to try some when it's finished?" Edmund's heart clenched at the boy's innocent enthusiasm. "Perhaps later, Thomas. Why don't you go check on the horses in the stable? I think Thunder might need some extra attention today." Thomas nodded eagerly and scampered off, leaving Edmund alone with Lily. She continued her work for a moment, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands moved with forced steadiness. "You have news," she said finally, not looking up from her preparations. "The sheriff is coming tomorrow. Someone has reported that Thomas can read." Lily's hands stilled, and for a long moment the only sound was the rain drumming against the kitchen windows. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a resignation that spoke of a lifetime of preparing for the worst. "What will you do?" Edmund had rehearsed this conversation in his mind a dozen times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words stuck in his throat. "There's a family in Savannah. Good people. They would take Thomas, give him a position in their household." "You mean sell him?" "I mean save him." Edmund's voice broke slightly. "Lily, if he stays here, if the sheriff finds evidence of his education, I know what will happen." Lily's voice was steady, but Edmund could see the tears gathering in her eyes. "I've always known this day would come. I hoped we would have more time." "So did I." They stood in silence for a moment, two people bound together by love for the same child, facing an impossible choice. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last of winter and preparing the ground for whatever would grow in its place. "Will I be able to see him?" Lily asked quietly. Edmund's silence was answer enough. "And you? Will you ever see him again?" "I don't know," Edmund admitted. "Probably not." Lily nodded, accepting this final cruelty with the same grace she had shown throughout their ordeal. "When?" "Tonight. A wagon will come after dark. It's better if he doesn't know where he's going until he's already gone. You want me to lie to my son. I want you to protect him from a truth that would only cause him pain." That evening, as the household settled into its nighttime routine, Edmund found himself in the parlour with Elizabeth, reading her a bedtime story, as he had done countless times before. But tonight, the familiar ritual felt hollow, weighted with the knowledge of what was about to happen. "Papa," Elizabeth said as he closed the book, "why does Thomas have to work in the quarters? Why can't he live in the big house like us?" Edmund's heart ached at his daughter's innocent question. "Because that's the way the world works, sweetheart. There are rules that we have to follow, even when we don't like them. But the rules aren't fair, are they? Thomas is just as smart as me, smarter even. He knows more stories and can solve harder problems." "No," Edmund said quietly, "the rules aren't fair." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, then looked up at her father with eyes that held too much understanding for an 11-year-old. "Papa, is Thomas my brother?" The question hit Edmund like a thunderbolt. He stared at his daughter, seeing in her face the same intelligence that had made Thomas so remarkable, the same ability to see through the lies and pretenses that adults used to shield children from uncomfortable truths. "Why would you ask that?" "Because he looks like you. And because you look at him the way you look at me sometimes. And because—" She hesitated, then forged ahead with the fearless honesty of childhood. "Because I love him like I think I would love a brother." Edmund pulled his daughter close, feeling the weight of all the secrets and lies that had shaped their lives. "Elizabeth, there are some things in this world that are too complicated for children to understand. I'm not a child anymore, Papa. I'm 11, and I can see things." "What do you see?" "I see that you love Thomas, and I see that it makes you sad because you can't show it the way you show your love for me." Edmund closed his eyes, overwhelmed by his daughter's perception and compassion. "You're right. I do love Thomas. But that love, it's dangerous, Elizabeth, for him and for us. Because he's a slave. Because the world we live in doesn't allow for certain kinds of love." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness that Edmund had come to expect from her. "Papa, if you could change the world, would you?" "Yes," Edmund said without hesitation, "I would change everything." Later that night, as the rain finally began to subside, Edmund stood at his bedroom window and watched as a covered wagon made its way down the muddy road toward the quarters. His heart felt as if it were being torn from his chest as he saw Lily emerge from her cabin with Thomas, the boy still sleepy and confused about the late-night journey. From his window, Edmund could see the moment when Thomas realized what was happening. The boy's small figure went rigid, and even from a distance, Edmund could hear his cries of protest. He watched as Lily knelt down and spoke to her son, her hands gentle on his face, trying to comfort him even as her own heart was breaking. Then Thomas broke away from his mother and ran toward the big house, his small legs carrying him as fast as they could through the mud and darkness. Edmund's breath caught as he realized the boy was coming to him, seeking the protection that Edmund had always provided but could no longer give. Edmund ran from his room and down the stairs, reaching the front door just as Thomas burst through it, his clothes muddy and his face streaked with tears. "Papa!" Thomas cried, throwing himself into Edmund's arms. "Please don't send me away. I'll be good, I promise. I won't read any more. I won't ask questions. I'll do whatever you want." Edmund held his son close, feeling the boy's small body trembling with fear and desperation. Behind them he could hear Margaret's sharp intake of breath as she witnessed this final, undeniable proof of the relationship they had all tried so hard to hide. "Thomas," Edmund said, his voice thick with emotion, "you haven't done anything wrong. You're the best boy I know, and I'm proud of you." "Then why are you sending me away?" Edmund knelt down so he could look directly into his son's eyes, eyes that were so like his own, filled with intelligence and love, and a trust that Edmund was about to betray. "Because sometimes loving someone means letting them go. Because staying here would be dangerous for you, and I can't bear the thought of anything happening to you." "I'm not afraid," Thomas said fiercely. "I want to stay with you and Mama and Miss Elizabeth. We're a family." The words broke Edmund's heart completely. "Yes," he whispered, "we are a family, and that's why I have to keep you safe, even if it means we can't be together." Thomas clung to Edmund with desperate strength, and for a moment Edmund allowed himself to imagine a different world, a world where he could claim this remarkable boy as his son, where love could triumph over law and custom, where families could be defined by bonds of the heart rather than the color of skin. But that world didn't exist, and the wagon was waiting. Gently, Edmund pried his son's arms from around his neck and stood up. "Thomas, you have to go now, but I want you to remember something. No matter where you are, no matter how far away, you will always be my son, always." Thomas nodded through his tears, trying to be brave. "Will I ever see you again?" Edmund's voice failed him, and he could only shake his head. As Lily came to collect her son, Thomas turned back one last time. "Papa, will you tell Miss Elizabeth goodbye for me? And tell her I'll miss playing with her." "I will," Edmund promised. And then they were gone, swallowed up by the darkness and the rain, leaving Edmund standing alone in the doorway of his grand house, surrounded by all the wealth and status that his choices had brought him, but feeling poorer than he had ever felt in his life. Behind him, Margaret stood in her nightgown, tears streaming down her face. "It's done," she said quietly. "Yes," Edmund replied, his voice hollow. "It's done." But even as he spoke the words, Edmund knew that nothing was truly finished. Thomas was gone, but the love remained, and the guilt, and the knowledge that he had chosen the safety of his reputation over the welfare of his son. The boy would grow up in Savannah, bright and capable and forever marked by the circumstances of his birth, while Edmund would remain at Magnolia Grove, master of everything he surveyed but slave to the choices he had made. The rain had stopped, and the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the sky. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed, announcing the start of a new day. But for Edmund Whitmore, the darkness would never truly lift. He had saved his son's life, but at the cost of his own soul, and that was a price he would pay for the rest of his days. In the years that followed, as the nation tore itself apart in civil war and the institution of slavery finally crumbled, Edmund would often wonder what became of Thomas. Did he survive the war? Did he find freedom? Did he ever think of the father who had loved him enough to let him go? These questions would haunt Edmund until his dying day, reminders of the son he had claimed in his heart, but could never acknowledge in the world, a boy who had taught him that love alone was not always enough to overcome the brutal realities of the society they lived in, but that it was still worth having, even when it came at the highest possible price. 20 years later, in the spring of 1878, an aging Edmund Whitmore sat on the same veranda where his story had begun, watching the sun set over fields that were now worked by free men and women earning wages for their labor. The world had changed beyond recognition. The war had come and gone. Slavery had been abolished, and the South was slowly rebuilding itself from the ashes of its former glory. Elizabeth, now 31, and married to a lawyer from Atlanta, visited occasionally with her own children, bringing laughter back to the halls of Magnolia Grove. But she never spoke of Thomas, though Edmund sometimes caught her staring out at the quarters with a wistful expression that suggested she remembered her childhood playmate more clearly than she let on. On this particular evening, as Edmund sat alone with his memories and his regrets, a figure appeared at the end of the long drive leading to the house. At first, Edmund thought it might be one of the workers returning late from the fields. But as the man drew closer, something about his bearing, proud, educated, purposeful, made Edmund's heart begin to race. The man was tall and well-dressed, with the bearing of someone who had made something of himself in the world. His skin was the color of warm honey, and his eyes were unmistakably familiar. Master Whitmore. The voice was deeper now, refined by education and experience, but Edmund would have known it anywhere. Thomas. The name escaped Edmund's lips as barely more than a whisper. It's Dr. Thomas Freeman now. And the man said with a slight smile, I took a new name when I gained my freedom, but I wanted you to know that I never forgot where I came from, or who my father was. Edmund rose from his chair on unsteady legs, his heart pounding with a mixture of joy and terror. What are you doing here? I'm a doctor now, graduated from Howard University in Washington. I've been practicing in Savannah, but I heard that your health was failing. I wanted to see you one more time. They stood facing each other across the years, and the pain, father and son reunited at last. Thomas had grown into everything Edmund had hoped he might become, educated, successful, dignified, but the cost of that achievement was written in the careful distance he maintained, the formal way he addressed the man who had given him life but had never been able to claim him. I'm glad you came, Edmund said finally. I've thought about you every day since that night. I know, Thomas replied. Mama told me before she died. She said you loved me as much as any father could love a son, but that the world wouldn't let you show it. Lily's gone. Edmund felt another piece of his heart break. 3 years ago, peacefully in her sleep, she lived to see freedom come, and she lived to see me become a doctor. She said that was enough. They talked through the evening, sharing 20 years of separation in a few precious hours. Thomas told Edmund about his life in Savannah, his education, his work as a physician serving the freed slaves who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. Edmund spoke of the war years, of the changes that had come to Magnolia Grove, of his regrets and his pride in the man his son had become. As the night grew late, Thomas prepared to leave. I won't be coming back, he said quietly. This needed to be done, but it's also an ending. We both know that. Edmund nodded, understanding. Thomas, I want you to know that sending you away was the hardest thing I ever did. But seeing what you've become, knowing that you're free and educated and making a difference in the world, I think maybe it was the right choice after all. Thomas studied his father's face for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn piece of slate, the same one Edmund had seen him practicing his letters on all those years ago. I kept this, Thomas said, to remind me that knowledge is power, and that power can be used to change the world. You gave me that gift, even if you couldn't give me your name. As Thomas walked away into the darkness, Edmund called after him one last time. I'm proud of you, son. I've always been proud of you. Thomas paused at the edge of the porch light, and for a moment the careful distance fell away. I know, Papa. I've always known. And then he was gone, leaving Edmund alone with his memories and the knowledge that love, even when it couldn't conquer all, could still create something beautiful and lasting in the world. Edmund Whitmore died 6 months later, taking with him the secrets and sorrows of a life lived in the shadow of an unjust system. But somewhere in Georgia, Dr. Thomas Freeman continued his work, healing the sick and fighting for justice. Carrying within him the best of both his parents, his mother's strength and his father's intelligence, tempered by the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving in a world that tried to deny your very humanity. The plantation master had wanted a son to carry on his name and inherit his wealth. Instead, he had given the world something far more valuable, a man who understood that true inheritance isn't measured in land or money, but in the courage to use your gifts to make the world a better place than you found it. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through one of America's most complex and painful chapters. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful historical dramas that explore the human cost of our nation's past. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, understanding our history, however difficult, is the first step toward building a more just future. The shadows of the past may be long, but they cannot extinguish the light of hope, love, and redemption that lives in the human heart.